At this point in the project, it's time to go ahead and do some cleanup. We've got some hard-coded values throughout our scripts, and right now our enemies can spawn slightly outside of the range of the camera, and our player can freely move completely outside of the range of the camera. So we're going to go ahead and fix those issues now. So to get started, let's go ahead and let's open up the enemy controller script. Now right now we've set it up so that enemies will go ahead and fire bullets at somewhere between 5 and 25 seconds. And they will always fire bullets. And we want to make our enemies a little bit more generic, as well as remove these hard-coded values. So to get started, we are going to go ahead and create a few variables here. Public float timer min, which we will set to a default of 5 float, and a public float timer max, which we will set to 25. And then we're also going to go ahead and set up a boolean, also public, called can fire bullets. And we're going to give that a default of true. So what we're going to use these variables for are, we're going to use these to replace the max timer bullet float, both its minimum and maximum ranges. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to make it so that we can create enemies and we can toggle this so that they don't fire bullets. They're just there on the screen. And that might be useful for creating just weak enemies early on in a game, or in this case we're going to use it for testing. So let's go ahead and for the timer minimum, let's go ahead and replace everywhere that we were setting the 5 and 25 float values in our code. We're going to replace them with the new variables. Okay. And then we're going to go ahead and in the update method, where we start the coroutine to fire a bullet, which starts the timers and does all the checking and eventually actually spawns a bullet, we're going to go ahead and wrap this in a if can fire bullets check. If the enemy can fire bullets, then we'll go ahead and start the fire bullet coroutine. So go ahead and save the enemy controller script and switch back over to Unity. And go to your prefabs folder and select the enemy prefab and open the prefab window. On the enemy controller script, there now should be 3 additional inputs, a timer min, a timer max, and a can fire bullets. As you can see, they've defaulted to 5, 25, and true, which in Visual Studio is what we defaulted to, 5, 25, and true. And the nice thing about adding these values here is that you allow anybody who is doing the design work within Unity to be able to go ahead and make modifications to enemies without having to go back to the code and without having to go ahead and add a bunch of if statements to say if it's this kind of enemy do this or that kind of enemy do that. I just apply the enemy controller script to an enemy prefab, and for that prefab I can go ahead and assign these values uniquely as needed. Now let's go ahead and let's disable can fire bullets, and you'll understand why in just a little bit. Now what I'd like you to do is let's go ahead and let's go back to our scripts folder and let's open up our enemy manager. Now, first things first, same thing, we have gone ahead and hard-coded the range with which we want to go ahead and spawn an enemy in. And here we've hard-coded it in 2 places, and it's between 5 and 12 seconds. Let's go ahead and let's create some additional public variables that will allow us to set these values in Unity to likewise create multiple enemy managers that can spawn whatever enemy type we've assigned to the enemy manager in Unity. And we can go ahead then and assign it specific time ranges for times that we want it to spawn in. So say you have a more difficult enemy that you want to spawn somewhere between 25 and 30 seconds, you can go ahead and assign that separately than the enemy manager that's managing your more common, weaker enemies. So let's go ahead and anywhere where we had hard-coded the 5 and 12, let's replace that with our new variables. And let's go ahead and save this script. Now at this point I want you to switch over to Unity. And in the hierarchy, should back up so that you can see everything that's in the scene. Select the enemy manager. As you see, it defaults the timer min and timer max to 5 and 12, just like we did here in the code where we said that the default should be 5 and 12. So between 5 and 12 seconds, we will spawn an enemy every time. Let's set these to 1 and 1. Go ahead and save and run this. Now what I'm trying to do here is spawn a lot of enemies very quickly. And I'm hoping that it will pop up so that you can see what problem we have. And there it is. See how enemies can spawn somewhat off screen? If I were to let this run for a long time, you might see it occur more drastically. Like this enemy is more than half off. Some of these enemies are slightly off. When we go ahead to add the keeping the player from moving off the screen, the fact that they can only fire from the center of the ship means that any enemy that spawns too far over, they won't be able to hit. Let's go ahead and stop this from running. So to go ahead and keep this from happening, what we need to do is we need to clamp the x-axis for the enemy spawn. We need to say whatever random point you got on the viewport, we still have to clamp it to make sure that it can't be less than 0 and greater than 1 in terms of the camera. Because remember, in Unity, bottom left of the camera is 0, 0, and the bottom right of the camera is 1, 1. So when you look at coordinates, you take world point coordinates and you convert them to camera coordinates. Anything in the camera is between 0, 0, and 1, 1. So right here is where we say, hey, spawn it anywhere between 0 and 1 for the x-axis of the camera. Okay? What we're going to do here is we are going to adjust the position of the x-axis. So let's go ahead and let's make a note here. Adjust x-axis position. No? Now, in order to go ahead and do this, we need to figure out where our camera sits in the world, and then we need to go ahead and we need to get the left and right borders of the camera. We then need to check and see, is the enemy spawn point including half of its width? Now we'll go ahead and we'll explain that as we get to it, beyond the borders of this screen. If so, then we need to go ahead and clamp to make sure that the value falls between the left and right. Now, to do this, I'm going to go ahead and start with getting the distance of the camera. Yeah. Remember, the distance is the z-axis, the distance of the camera from the other objects in the scene. Yeah? And then we need to get the left border and the right border of our camera. Now, because the camera exists in 0 and 1 coordinates, right, between those 2 points on both the x and y axis, we need to go ahead and take the viewport of the left and right of the camera and convert it to pixel coordinates. So from viewport to world point, because world point is in pixels. Okay. And to do that, we're going to go ahead and say, use a new vector 3, starting with the position of 0, 0, and then the z-axis that we gave it. Okay. Now what this is going to do is give us the 0 for the x-axis. So this is how we're getting the left border. Go ahead and copy this line, put it, and let's go ahead and let's get the right border. And this would go ahead and be a value of 1 for the x-axis, because we want all the way here to the right. So now we have our left border and our right border. Now, we need to go ahead and we need to get the size of our enemy sprite. So for our enemy manager, the enemy variable will contain the actual enemy that we're going to spawn in. So we need to go ahead and look at the enemy dot get component renderer dot bounds dot size. This will allow us to go ahead and get the width and height of the enemy. Now, why this matters. Let's go ahead and take our player, for example. Okay? Our player's center point is in the center of the sprite. That's how we have it set up. If I go ahead and say I want to spawn right here, my center point, which is the faint blue circle right there, is still within the camera. So if we did a basic check just to see am I within the bounds of the camera, it's going to say yes, it is inside the bounds of the camera because it's looking at the focal point. What we need to do is make sure that the center of our ship plus half of its width, which would allow us to shift back to this point, is inside the camera. Because none of our enemies can go ahead and spawn past this point because it's going to use the center of the prefab to determine is it within the view of the camera. So we only have to worry about shifting over by half the width, both on the left-hand side and the right-hand side of the screen. Let's put our player back in the middle there. And let's go back to Unity, or to Visual Studio. Okay? So now that we know the left and right border, and we have the size of our enemy, we can go ahead and we can clamp. In that case, I mean that literally, because we're going to use math function that is built into Unity called clamp to pass it the spawn point that we currently have on the x-axis and check to see does it fall within the left border bound plus half the width of the enemy, and does it fall within the right border bound minus half the width of the enemy. Now how math clamp works is, if spawn point x falls within this value and this value, it will go ahead and it will simply return spawn point x, reassign it to spawn point x, and we're fine. If it doesn't, then it will go ahead and it will shift spawn point x either to the left or right to ensure that it falls between these two different points. And either way, it ends up so that we have on the x-axis, the entirety of our enemy ship is spawning within the bounds of the camera. Let's go ahead and save this. Let's switch back over to Unity. Now, as you saw, we had on the enemy manager, we still have it set to between 1 and 1 second spawn an enemy in, and the prefab enemy, we still have Kinfire bullets turned off. That will go ahead and keep our player from being shot down and quickly spawn in a lot of enemies for us to go ahead and make sure that we don't see any of them spawning outside the bounds of the screen. If you give it a second to run, you can go ahead and visually verify that this is working, and it seems to be working just right. So we can go ahead and end this. Let's go ahead and let's go back to our enemy manager. Let's set our enemy manager back to between 5 and 12 seconds for how often we want it to spawn. And on our enemy prefab, let's go ahead and recheck Kinfire bullets and save the scene. So now our enemies are clamped into the view of the screen and they can fire bullets. We're able to shoot them and stop them. Now the other problem we're going to fix right now is the fact that I as the player can do that. I can come back in. So you can see it kind of can allow you to go ahead and circumvent certain features of the game. So Let's go ahead and let's go back to Visual Studio. Now, what we're going to do is, just after we go ahead and call our, maybe on the player controller script, just after we call move, we're going to go ahead and call another method that we're going to create called bound movement. And then we're going to the bottom of our script and we're going to add that method, bound movement. Now, what this is going to do is we are going to use something similar to what we did for the enemies. However, for that we were going ahead and only needing to check where an enemy was placed. Where an enemy was placed and binding its x-axis after the fact to ensure that it fell within the range of the camera. For the player is constantly moving. So that's why we put into the update method, we are checking where they're moving and binding that movement. Okay, we're going to clamp it. So same thing as before, we need to go ahead and get the z-axis of the camera so that we understand when performing our math functions what distance the camera is from the actual objects in our scene. Transform. Okay. So that camera.main.transform.position. Let's see. Okay. Looks like I have some float dist. So go ahead and just make sure you double check what you wrote. There are mistakes right there while typing. Okay. And we're going to go ahead and I'm going to copy this and put it in so that you can go ahead and see what's going on all at once. Cool. Alright, so like I said, this is very similar to what we did with the enemies. Here we're going to go ahead and still get the distance of the camera, and then we're also going to get the left border, right border. You already saw that. And then we're also going to get the top and the bottom border. And that's where we go ahead and we get 0 for the y-axis and 1 for the y-axis. So the bottom and top of the screen. For the player, we need to also know the size of the player sprite because we likewise have to take into account that the player could be partially on the screen and technically fall within the rules of the clamp, which is their center point there. Okay. So we get the left, right, top, bottom. We get the size of the player to work with. And then we go ahead and we are manually setting the player's position to a new vector 3 using the clamp method on the player's x and y axes. And then we just pass in the z position that the player already had. We don't need to modify that, so just pass it back in. Okay? And since I go ahead and I call it in the, you named the method the same in both places. Again, I called it in the update method. Immediately after the player moves, we're then going to go ahead and check where they move to and adjust that movement based upon the size of the camera and the edges. So let's go ahead and let's switch back over to Unity and let's run our project. The player should be bound. Sure enough, the player cannot leave the screen. Although that bug we're going to go ahead and address in the next video.